Hello everybody, I'm here today with Matthew Hooker, who is going to talk to us about his exciting new deposit replacement service called Ohm. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me. How are you?
Very well, thank you. Right, you're going to talk to us about Ohm and you've done a presentation. So shall we just sort of talk our way through your presentation?
Yeah, let's go.
So do you want to move the slide forward?
Yep, there we go. So obviously I'm going to speak a little about, but we can talk as we go along about who Ohm is or who Ohm are. I'm still not sure on the grammar there.
It's a bit of an odd name. Where did you get it from?
Well, I want to give you a story as to where it's come from really, but it's just something that kind of popped up. I think it's because it's that casual way of saying home. It's that comfortable approach to living. Which is something that we want to elicit with all our customers, sort of seeing the letting industry or the lettings process as something that's a little bit more comfortable than we used to. And then it just stuck, to be honest.
Okay.
So there's nothing big there, no story, but it's stuck.
Okay, so who are you? From your name, Matthew Hooker, I would assume that you have some connection with Eddie Hooker.
And Sean, there's a few of us dotted around.
The dreaded hookers.
The dreaded hookers. We are coming for you all. But no, there's a few of us. So Eddie is my father, and Sean is my uncle. And I've never been allowed to stay away from the lettings industry. Let's put it that way. Okay,
inducted from birth.
Yes, I've been reading the My Deposits terms and conditions and the property redress schedules from birth, so I'm pretty well versed.
So you were sort of brought up with the business, basically. I mean, which sort of, how did you get into doing the Ohm thing then?
Well, shall I move? Yeah, I can explain a little bit. So obviously these are the various brands that Ohm is aligned with, and obviously we're part of the Hamilton Fraser Group. And really my journey with Hamilton Fraser started probably 10 years or so ago. So anyone that's called up My Deposits, PRS or CMP in the last 10 years may have ended up speaking to me. I've essentially started on the phones with My Deposits customer service, either in summers or part-time working whilst I was doing my education. I took a year out to go and explore after my degree the world of recruitment, but even that was in letting agency and property development. And then came back to Hamilton Fraser as part of the management trainee program. So I've dotted around the rest of the business 6 months, a bit like so I did a law degree, and a bit like how you qualify to be a solicitor, you do the 6-month rotations. I had my very own sort of 6-month rotations of almost the entire lettings industry by going through Hamilton Fraser's scheme. Got my MFOP qualifications, that sort of thing, and then following that moved into moved into the business transformation and innovation at Hamilton Fraser.
So you're transforming and innovating it.
Trying to from the inside. So lots of it was kind of about new products and new services, and hence where Ohm and its deposit replacement came from. But a lot of it is also our internal processes and I suppose also our external processes. So 90% of our products all have some element of redress at the end. So can we really make that a nice, slick, technological and innovative experience for everyone? So that's kind of a 50-50 split at the moment between Ohm and everything else that could be either in Ohm or elsewhere, sort of thing. So
let's have a look at Ohm then.
Let's move on. So I suppose the question you're asking is why are we here? So, and particularly as some of you may have also seen from Eddie, the white papers over the last few years about our journey with deposit replacements. But essentially we're here because we believe that tenants should have the choice to manage their own money in a way that sort of best suits them. So some tenants have a deposit, some tenants have the deposit, but maybe they don't want to use it specifically all at once. But equally, landlords, when they are allowing that tenant to have a choice, should also make sure that they are financially protected. Obviously, all too often on the phones at My Deposits, you'd see a landlord who's maybe tried to circumvent some of the processes to allow the tenant to have a bit more freedom or a little bit more financial flexibility, but that often would lead them to being in a trickier situation themselves. So that was the sort of the balancing act that we wanted to get right. How can tenants manage their money in their circumstances, but also make sure that the landlords are always protected?
Okay.
And then back onto that experience of sort of the business transformation and innovation, one of the things we wanted to make sure we did right with Ohm was, where possible, technology should both be raising the standards of the experience, standards of the industry, but also the experience of those in our industry, making things easy, not asking for questions more than once, essentially, and things like that, which I'm hoping has come across in the product as well.
Okay.
And then I'll just go into a little bit more detail about from a tenant and a landlord's experience. So we are all aware that rents have risen over the last 10 years and deposits have risen. But what I was quite interested to understand a little bit when we did some research was, what does that deposit sort of mean for a tenant? And in that instance of that research, we found out that 55% of the average net monthly wage would be the equivalent of a deposit. So it's quite a big sum of money, especially when you're considering that when you move in, you've got to pay the first month's rent and moving costs. So as I say, 10 weeks rent, if you sort of round it up a little bit or down, depending, it's quite a hefty amount all up front.
Yeah.
And I haven't got the stats in front of me just yet, but there's something like 55% or 52% of 22 to 29-year-olds, for example, have absolutely no savings. Yeah. And the average savings across the country is only £800. So you're starting to see sort of quite a big chunk of money going away from people that actually could need it, not necessarily a rainy day, but just for that security of having a bit of cash to fall back on if they needed to. So, for example, in our current circumstances of COVID-19, if you had that financial security, you may not be considering having to default on rent because you know you've got a little bit of cash stored away for a rainy day. So it was all of those sort of thoughts that we had in mind.
I suppose also many tenants, if they haven't got the money, they'll just have to borrow.
Well, that's the thing as well. So what we don't want, what one of the core pillars of our processing when we went through how we're going to build this product was also to not allow tenants to stretch themselves. If you're going to remove the upfront cost, it's got to be something that is manageable. So we didn't want them having to turn to expensive loans or credit cards. But equally, I think there's a sense of pride sometimes. So fine, if you move away from the students and actually into your first proper professional let, so to speak, your first home outside of the parental four walls, sometimes you want to be able to manage your money on your own without having to ask for help. So as much as we're hopefully helping the bank of mum and dad manage their money correctly, we also wanted tenants who are going out on their own and becoming independent to have another choice if they don't have, even if they haven't had the time to save up that money yet. Okay. And then there's that double bubble effect at the bottom. So that's something that our team use quite a lot internally. Everyone will have different names for it, but that's essentially where a tenant has already got a deposit in a deposit scheme or with an agent that uses the insured back scheme, and they've got to wait for that to go through the process. But obviously they've got to move into a new home. So essentially you've got to have two deposits on the go. Yeah. So not only are we now looking at £1,300 as an average deposit, but you're looking at £2,600, which becomes even more challenging. And I'll just quickly move on to the landlords as well. So one of the things that you'd often hear on the phone lines, doesn't matter what product it was at How Much to Phrase it was either my deposits, it'd either be PRS with the complaints, but also I mentioned on the first slide, landlord action, where landlords are trying to sort of find a solution with tricky tenants. If you get anything wrong with the deposits, cash deposits, there's a 3-time deposit fine, or up to 3 times deposit fines. Again, it starts to become quite onerous for a landlord, or even agents, to be honest. I was on the phone to an agent in Leicester the other day, and she was telling me that they'd registered the deposit, they'd sent out the information, they'd signed in, they'd done all the check-in, check-out reports, but due to a admin error, the money didn't hit the deposit scheme until 3 days after their initial 30 days. And the judge gave them a full 3-time fine. And even though you could see that every step had been exactly the same and every single process had been followed minus one bank transfer, they were on the hook, and it was quite a large deposit, and obviously 3 times a large deposit becomes a bit of a big problem. So we wanted to try and help there as well. And then I guess from an agent perspective, the legislation's changing. You have to protect the client money that you hold. A lot of agents are therefore going towards custodial deposit protection, which then starts to ask the question, if I'm not holding the money, then does there need to be money? So there's a lot of these sort of changing thoughts in the industry. But I think that last bullet point is probably the most important one. So since the launch of all these deposit replacements in the last 4 or 5 years, and since our own sort of white papers and opinion pieces on the topic, we've actually had sort of large and small customers just asking us why we haven't done one. Why didn't we launch one early? Why haven't we done this, that, and the other? Because they want to offer the tenants, but they also want something that they trust and sort of know. So a combination of those points really led us to launching from a landlord or agent's perspective as well.
Okay. Matt, I'm going to cut this out, but just want to say that there's a half-hour limit for this.
No problems.
Should have mentioned that, but I'll chop this out. We've done about 10 minutes so far.
Wonderful. That's not a problem. Shall I move on?
Yeah, move on now. I'll cut this bit out.
Wonderful. No worries. So how are we going to help those problems? Well, the first thing first is we wanted to limit that upfront payment to as small as possible. So the traditional deposit replacement world is sort of a week's upfront rent, and that typically covers you for about 2 years. But if you're a student that's only got a year tenancy, or you're moving into your first home in London for a job or whatever the case may be, you don't know how long you're going to be there. So we wanted it to be very much a minimal upfront payment and then almost pay as you go. So that initial £30 setup fee, and then from there on it could be a £5, £10, £15 membership per tenancy agreement. But from the benefits of having my deposits, we could do a bit of analysis on the data there, and we've worked out that 86% of tenants in the UK are going to be paying less than £9 a month each. And that's because we've built in some little mechanisms that allow a tenant, if they're in a joint and several agreement, to sort of split the payments between them if they want. So it's all about flexibility. But importantly, we give that landlord the 5 weeks rent protection, the same as a traditional cash deposit. So at the end of the tenancy, if there is an issue between the tenant and the landlord and they can't agree who broke the vase or who marked the wall, then again, we'll offer that free access to resolution. And if the tenant still doesn't pay at the end of that resolution or can't pay, then the way we work it is we'll pay the landlord or the agent, and then we'll set up that arrangement to collect the money from the tenant ourselves. So essentially, we want to be able to get to a point where within 2 weeks of an adjudication, if we get that far, the landlord has their money, and then we can start to work out the best plan with the tenant ourselves.
Okay, so just a couple of things. So the fee that they pay, the £30 and the average of £9 a month, the tenants don't get that back, and it isn't offset against the damage. It's a fee that they...
Yeah. So that covers the running costs of the product, but I suppose more importantly that resolution service at the end. It is, I would regard it as sort of as a premium alternative. I wouldn't sort of shy away from any of that, and I don't want to ever say it's an affordability tool, because going back to what we were saying before, it's not about it's about trying to avoid tenants stretching themselves. They go through that sort of affordability check, so we want to make sure that it's an option for them in that sense, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say it seems quite reasonable, because I think with a lot of other schemes, they have to pay for the resolution, whereas you don't charge for that. So that's a really good point in your favour.
Oh, 100%. I think that was always a core. If we couldn't have worked out a product that didn't allow for free resolution, we wouldn't have done it. That's something that Hamilton Fraser was very adamant on. We looked at all sorts of flavors of deposit replacement, deposit loans, whatever that you may want to call it, but free resolution was always going to be that core principle. I mean, speaking on reasonable fees as well, we've been speaking to quite a large student provider who sort of works across the UK, and it worked out, obviously students look at it on a weekly rent basis, so £100 here or £80 or whatever the case may be. And for the average student, it was going to add 74p onto their weekly rent. So it becomes almost too small to notice, if that makes sense. So we're hoping that it's quite a reasonable price point. But as you say, the other schemes have put that money up front. Over a 2-year period, we are more or less the same price. So I think we've sort of worked out a happy medium of using the ability that we have as a larger business to stagger those payments, but also make sure that the lights stay on, if that makes sense.
Yeah, excellent.
So from a landlord or an agent's perspective, how do we get started? So one of the benefits of a deposit replacement scheme is that there's no money being held. So we can actually have you sign up with pretty much just an email, a question of your name or your company's name, that sort of thing. It's actually quite simple just to pop in. From there on, we only really ask for 3 things. We ask you to reference your tenants. So we do have our minimum referencing criteria on our website, but other than that, we don't have a specific provider or a process. We don't want to change how you do your lettings operation. Just got to make sure that they meet, I think it's 3 criteria on our website. From that point, you just invite your tenants essentially. So you go online onto our your account on our website, and like the deposit schemes that you're used to, you just put in the property address, the rent amount, and then the email address for the tenant. That pops them across a invitation where they create the membership, they do the rest, they put in their payment details, and then we'll notify you to say that that's all been done. There's no prescribed information, but we'll send you sort of an equivalent certificate if you prefer to keep your filing consistent between cash deposit and the replacement.
So unlike a traditional deposit, when the tenant pays the deposit money to the landlord or the agent, in this case, the tenant pays the money to the scheme, to you.
Yes, yeah. So they're our customer. And again, that goes back to the ability that we'll have to then take responsibility for collecting the money from the tenant, because they're contractually signing up. And I don't have to explain to you, Tessa, you're legally trained yourself, but essentially that becomes our own responsibility between us and the tenant. And then obviously we agree with the landlord to protect them as well. Okay. And then the final step there is just that check-in report. Now, whilst we say it's mandatory, it really should be mandatory for everyone anyway. But you would be surprised with the amount of disputes that go to My Deposits or the or HF Resolution, who do the independent ones for some of the other deposit replacements. How many cases they receive and look at which doesn't have a check-in report or something similar to explain what the start of the property or the tenancy was, to give that sort of condition report. So we're making it a mandatory task, but to be honest, it was mandatory anyway. It's just sort of for admin purposes. Okay, so then one of the questions that we're often asked is how does the end of tenancy work? So it's very, very similar to what you would expect with a deposit scheme. The only difference is that there is no money to exchange at the moment. So when the tenant moves out, the landlord and the tenant should have those 10 days just to negotiate any settlements. That's the quickest time to resolve whether it's a deposit or a deposit replacement. Tenant, if they agree, then just pays the landlord and everyone's happy. If there's no agreement, then we go through that standard process of alternate dispute resolution. So the landlord this time raises the escalation, the settlement request, and then they put the evidence in. The tenant will have their time to put the evidence in as well. We're introducing mediators into our process as well, something that we're trying to do across all of the products at Hamilton Fraser. They'll look at the case and essentially look and think, well, if there's a little bit of opportunity to bring 2 parties in and talk properly, then they'll do that. But if there can't be any resolution that's found as a result of mediation, obviously we'll go towards the adjudicators. And then following that decision, as I say, the tenants have 10 days to pay. If the tenant doesn't pay within the 10 days, we'll make sure that we pay the landlord, and then we take responsibility for collecting from the tenant. Going back to what I was saying about sort of business transformation and innovation, this process we're really working on to get a really nice global resolution panel for all our products at Hamilton Fraser. So regardless of which direction you end up going, if you're in the ecosystem of our brands, then you'll have that exact same experience with the mediation, the negotiation, that sort of thing.
And I suppose for submitting the evidence, which is, you know,
yeah,
that they do that through your portal, do they?
Yeah, so that'll be through the portal, and as I say, once we've launched the new resolution panel as well, that'll be really quite nice and slick as well, mobile accessible and stuff like that. So it's a moving feast, but these are the core pillars of the end of tenancy settlements.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that we're coming to an end, and obviously this is a pre-recorded one, so I've put together some frequently asked questions. Do you mind me going through these, Tessa, or do you have any questions in mind?
That looks like a good question. Let's do that one.
No problem. So this is our most asked question. So what happens if the tenant stops paying their monthly membership fee? So as I say, the tenant's our customer, so it's our responsibility to make sure they keep paying. But we've provided the product on the premise that the landlord is protected. So if the tenant doesn't pay, then we will still honour that protection for the landlord. Obviously, we'll let you guys know that the tenant's not paid, because if they're not paying a £5 membership, then what's next to be on the list of cutting from the payments? But it might just be a case of an expired card or whatever the case may be, which in that case, we've got technology and some processes that will help alleviate those problems. But as far as a landlord or an agent is concerned, if the tenant stops paying, we'll still protect your interests, your 5 weeks deposit value.
And you'll go after the tenant for the payments.
Yeah, that's our buck to bear.
Okay.
And then I guess a similar one, which is what happens if they don't pay for the settlements after an adjudication. So again, I've mentioned this before, but we'll make sure that we reimburse the landlord and we then collect the funds. So it's the same sort of principle, really. We're making sure that if the landlord has offered the choice in the goodness of their heart, then we don't want to end up burning their fingers because they've allowed a tenant to choose an option that best suits them.
Mm-hmm.
Do we have any APIs? So yes, if you would like to integrate the products, then that is launching in the summer. So I'm sure Tess will provide our contact details, and if that's something that's interesting for you, then we can look into that. We've got those on the way.
Okay.
Is there any cost to a landlord or agent? So absolutely not. The only thing you need to provide us with is details to create your account and then the email address to send the tenant their invitation. Mm-hmm. It's really as simple as that.
Okay.
And then I think this is the final one. Do I need to serve any prescribed information? As I said, no, there's no deposits exchanging hands, so the legislation doesn't apply. We will send you a certificate that's pretty much the same sort of information you would expect from a prescribed information. But that's just for those that like to have a consistent admin system that is all together and similar. I think that's possibly the last one.
Okay, so you operate across the whole of the UK?
Whole of the UK. Obviously, check the tenant fee legislation in your areas. I know that obviously Scotland has quite a prescribed legislation when it comes to tenant fees. So we can operate in all regions, but I would always make sure that landlords and agents just check what is required in their regions just in case.
I mean, the main requirement, I suppose, certainly in England and Wales, is that you have to offer a traditional deposit as well.
Yes,
you
so that's
that they use Ohm.
No, of course, no. I mean, I think that's the real important bit. As long as it's a choice, and as that was the legislative requirement, that's why it became such a core pillar of our product. So as long as the tenant has the choice between a cash deposit or a deposit replacement of any flavour, then it will always, in England anyway, England and Wales meet the requirements of the tenant fee legislation.
Well, that's very interesting. I mean, from what I've seen, that generally with deposit replacement schemes, the negatives tend to be that unlike a traditional deposit, the tenants don't get the money back, and that's still the same for your case, but the fees are fairly minimal.
Yes, so if you're only in the property for 6 months or 12 months, you only pay for those 6 or 12 months, as you say, because I think that is one of the drawbacks. It does, in theory, make a tenant net less wealthy. But sometimes the opportunity of having £1,000 sitting in your bank account to do something else with is quite useful, as long as that tenant still is aware. And that's the important bit from our perspective, but all landlords and agents, that they are still responsible come the end of the tenancy. And I think it's always that communication that is the important bit there.
Yeah, I mean, it's a sort of cash flow thing. I have to say, the thing that I really like about this scheme is that it's very transparent as to fees. I mean, I understand that some other schemes, there are sort of fees embedded in it, and people might not necessarily be aware of them. And in particular, there are no fees charged for the adjudication. I think that's really nice.
Yeah, that was something. When we did our first early research, we couldn't find any other terms and conditions. We couldn't find any sort of list of fees. And there's more work we need to do. Some people have found some of our aspects of our website a little bit tricky, so we're working on those as well. And I think transparency goes two ways. We want to know what isn't transparent, if that makes sense. We want to know the feedback so we can improve that further. And as I say, the terms and conditions are all on the website for anyone to find. Essentially, the long and short of it is that because of our other brands, particularly the ones that are government authorized, we just ran the product or the services or the process to the same principles. If the government wants transparency on traditional deposit protection, then we think we should owe it to our customers that the transparency is there when we provide an alternative. That's kind of where we were coming from, I guess.
So if any of the listeners want to sign up with Ohm and offer it to their tenants, what do they do?
So they just go to our website, which is www.ohq.com. I do have website, the link there. They just press any one of the many buttons that we have that says get started or register. We'll send, you put in your email address, we'll send you a link. All you do is you press that link, it creates your account for you, you just put in your information and off you go. We've tried to basically draw a lot of our inspiration from a lot of the challenger banks and fintechs that are maybe 2 or 3 steps ahead of our industry. So security wise, there's no passwords to remember. It's very secure in that sense. So we're hoping that it's as slick and as easy as possible. But again, feedback's always important. So any thoughts or feedback on those that do use our product would be really, really helpful.
Okay, well, Matthew, thank you very much indeed for coming along and explaining it to us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me, Tessa.
Okay, thank you.